When Morris Carver ducked out of a cold afternoon rain into a small corner cafe called Marlowe's, shaking the water off a plain gray hoodie, he was not looking for anyone. He had 20 minutes between two things and wanted coffee and a dry chair. 3 championship rings in a safe a long way off. A net worth that didn't fit on a single line, and a face the few customers were too busy to clock. He saw her before he sat down. A woman in a cafe apron was wiping down a two-top by the window, moving with the careful economy of someone whose feet have been hurting for a long time. Gray threaded through her hair now, reading glasses pushed up on her head. But Maurice would have known the set of those shoulders in the dark, in a crowd, anywhere on earth, because he had been married to them for 9 years. Lorraine, his ex-wife, bussing tables at a cafe in the rain. Before his brain could even finish the thought, a man in a damp suit at the next table snapped his fingers at her. "Hello? I asked for this cleared 10 minutes ago. Do you work here or not?" He shoved a plate toward the edge so it nearly fell. Unbelievable. "I'm so sorry, sir, right away," Lorraine said. And there was no fight in it. Only the worn, smooth courtesy of a woman who'd learned to swallow worse. She wiped his crumbs into her hand. And Maurice Carver sat down in the corner, out of her sight line, and said absolutely nothing. He ordered a coffee he didn't drink and let his eyes move, the way they always did when the truth was somewhere in the room and hadn't shown itself yet. The first thing he noticed was her shoes. Cheap, flattened, resoled. The shoes of a woman on her feet 60 hours a week. Lorraine, who'd once had a closet he used to tease her about. The second thing was the name tag pinned crooked to her apron. Lorraine H. Hale. Her maiden name. She'd given his back. The third thing was the corner booth. 3 backpacks stacked against the wall and 3 kids in it. A teenage girl, maybe 16, doing homework with her jaw set. A boy around 12 kicking the table leg, and a little one, 7 or so, coloring. Between tables, Lorraine kept glancing at that booth, the way you check on the only fire keeping you warm. The fourth thing was a locket she wore over the apron. Old gold, the kind that holds 2 small photographs. She touched it once, without knowing she did, when she looked at the kids. The fifth thing was the schedule taped behind the register, where her name ran down the column more nights than anyone else's. Doubles, closes, the shifts nobody wants. Maurice noticed every one of them. He did not react. He wrapped both hands around a coffee going cold and felt his chest start to hurt. Now here is the part that nobody in that cafe understood yet. The man in the corner had spent the better part of a decade carrying a small, unexamined resentment toward the woman wiping tables. The quiet belief that she had grown distant, walked away from their marriage when his life was at its loudest, and gone off to live comfortably on a generous settlement while he licked his wounds. He had told that story to himself so many times, it had hardened into a fact. It was not a fact, and what Morris Carver was about to learn, about where every dollar of that settlement went, about what this woman had been doing in silence for 8 years while he assumed the worst of her, was going to take that hardened little story and break it, and break his heart along with it. What he had no idea about, watching her clear a rude man's plate, was one single truth sitting in a corner booth doing long division. So stay with us for the whole video. Because the reason Big Mo's ex-wife was cleaning tables at 50 years old is not the reason anyone watching would guess. And when he found out, this composed, careful man put his face in his hands in the middle of a cafe and wept. Maurice met Lorraine after the championships, after the money, after he'd already become Big Mo, which mattered, because it meant she never wanted any of it. She was a 4th-grade teacher when they met, sharp and funny and entirely unimpressed by him. And that was the whole reason he fell. She kept teaching after they married. She had her own everything. In 9 years, she never once asked him for a thing. The marriage didn't end in a scandal. That was almost the worst part. There was no villain, no betrayal, nothing dramatic enough to explain it. He was gone 200 days a year. The distance got into the walls. They became two kind people having a quiet conversation as in a house that had stopped being a marriage. And one day they admitted it, and it ended the way a long rain ends, without thunder. He'd offered her a generous settlement out of guilt and respect. She'd taken it without a fight. And then they drifted into the particular silence of people who once shared a bed and now share only a lawyer's forwarding address. He'd let himself believe she was fine. It was easier to be a little resentful of a woman who was fine than to wonder about one who wasn't. What he never let himself think much about was her family, and specifically her younger sister, Denise. The two of them had been stitched together since birth, the kind of sisters who finished each other's sentences. Their mother had given them a locket each, with both their faces inside, when they were girls. Denise had married a good man named Terrence and had 3 kids, and Lorraine had loved those children like her own. And Maurice, busy, traveling, distracted, had been fond of them in the distant way of an uncle who's never quite there. He had not thought about Denise in years. He was about to find out he should have. There had been a fight over those children once, and the woman on the other side of it was not a monster. Her name was Corinne, Terrence's mother, the children's paternal grandmother. When the accident happened, when Denise and Terrence were killed on a wet highway one night 8 years ago and 3 children woke up orphans, Corinne had fought Lorraine for custody. Hard. Lawyers, hearings, the whole brutal machinery of it dragged out over a year. But Corinne was not grasping for money or spite. Corinne had just buried her only son. Those 3 grandchildren were the last living pieces of him on earth, and a drowning woman will grab the last piece of her child the way she'd grab a plank in open water. Her grief came out looking like a fight, because grief often does. She wasn't wrong to want them. She was just one of 2 people who loved the same children more than their own comfort, and only one home could hold all 3 together. Lorraine won, barely, because the court agreed the siblings should not be split, and Lorraine was the one offering to keep all 3 under one roof. But the year of lawyers had cost her. It had cost her most of the settlement, and the rest of what that settlement had been for was about to become very clear. Corinne had backed away in defeat and shame, and the 2 grieving women had not spoken since. That was its own quiet tragedy, sitting underneath the louder one. The teenage girl in the corner booth was named Imani. She was 16, and after she finished her homework, Maurice watched her tie on a spare apron and start clearing tables alongside Lorraine, without being asked, the way you do a thing you've done 1,000 times. The boy was Jordan, 12, all elbows and worry. The little one coloring was Rosa, 7, who had been an infant when her parents died and had never known any mother but the aunt, now refilling ketchup bottles. Benny, the cafe's old cook, slipped the kids' day-old muffins through the pass and pretended he hadn't. Miss Fay, a regular pushing 75, watched the whole little family the way you watch something you've decided to be quietly proud of. The rude man in the suit flagged Lorraine again, complaining now about his check, and the manager came over and, instead of defending her, told Lorraine in front of the man that she'd be docked for the slow service, and that if she couldn't keep up, maybe the closing shift wasn't for her. Imani's head came up sharp. Lorraine put a hand on her arm, "Don't," and said, "Yes, understood. It won't happen again," and went back to work. And her 16-year-old went back to work beside her, with her eyes shining and furious. And Maurice Carver could not stay in his chair 1 second longer. But before you find out what he did, before this composed man comes apart in a corner cafe, You need to understand what he'd just finished piecing together, and why the answer was about to land on him like a building. Nobody was watching him. Lorraine hadn't seen his face. 3 kids cleared tables and did homework. The rain ran down the glass. The whole little cafe held its breath without knowing it. He stood up, and he crossed the room, and Lorraine turned with her automatic apology already forming. "I'm sorry, I'll be right with you." And then she saw who it was, and the rag stopped in her hand, and 8 years of carrying it alone came up into her face all at once. Shock, and then shame, and then a terrible effort to stand up straight in a cafe apron in front of the man who'd known her when she had everything. "Maurice." Barely a sound. "Lorraine." He kept his voice gentle. He glanced once at the corner booth, the 3 kids, the backpacks, the locket on her chest, and then back at her, and he asked the only question that mattered. "The settlement. Everything you had. Where did it go?" She didn't lie to him. She never had. She just looked over at the booth, at the 16-year-old and the 12-year-old and the 7-year-old, the last living pieces of the sisters she'd been stitched to since birth. And she said it quietly, with no self-pity in it at all. That's where it went. And there it was. The truth the whole cafe had been sitting inside without knowing it. Denise and Terrence had died 8 years ago. 3 children had woken up orphans, headed for separate foster homes in separate towns. And Lorraine Hale had taken all 3. She'd spent the settlement fighting for them and then keeping them. A bigger apartment. 3 sets of everything. A year of lawyers, braces, school clothes, a counselor for the boy who couldn't sleep. And when the money ran out, she'd sold what was left and gone back to work. Any work, every work. Cleaning tables on the closing shift because it fit around school pickups and a 7-year-old's bedtime. For 8 years. And she had never once called her famous ex-husband. Because, as she told him now, with the locket trembling on her chest, "They weren't yours to carry, Maurice. Denise was my sister. You don't split up what's left of a family. I wasn't going to make her kids your obligation just because you could afford them. That's not a thing you do to people you used to love." And Maurice Carver, the most composed man in any room, sat down hard in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands and wept. For the children, for Denise. For the 8 years he'd spent resenting a woman who turned out to be the finest person he'd ever been lucky enough to marry. Here is what he did, when he could speak. He did not whip out a checkbook like a magic trick. He got up, and he went to the corner booth first, and he crouched down to Rosa's level and quietly helped her finish coloring a sky, and shook Jordan's hand like a man, and told Imani, who'd been clearing tables at 16 to lighten her aunt's load, that he had seen exactly what she was doing for this family, and that he would not forget it. Then he stood up and turned to Lorraine. "You were right that they weren't mine to carry," he said. "You did the right thing not asking. But I'm asking you now. Let me carry them with you. Not because I can afford it, because they're family and you taught me what that word costs." He handled all of it, and quietly. The debts, gone. A real home for the 4 of them, paid for, theirs. A trust for Imani and Jordan and Rosa deep enough that none of them would ever lack for anything again. He got Lorraine out of the closing shift and back to the things she'd loved before all of this. A classroom of her own, on her terms. And he did one more thing. The hardest and the kindest. He found Corinne, the grieving grandmother who'd lost the custody fight and a son, and he brought the 2 women into the same room. And he gave Corinne back what grief had taken from her, a real place in the lives of the only grandchildren she had left. The fight had never really been about who loved the kids. It had been about the fact that both of them did. His ex-wife had said it in a cafe apron with a rag in her hand. You don't split up what's left of a family. She'd given everything she had to keep that true. And so should you. So look at what one cold, rainy afternoon dragged into the light. A grieving grandmother who got handed back a piece of her son. A 16-year-old who'd been clearing tables to spare her aunt, who finally got to just be a kid. An old cook who slipped muffins through the pass for free, and a regular who'd been quietly proud of a struggling family, both of whom got to see it turn out right. 3 orphans who never got split up because one woman refused to let it happen. And a man who spent 8 years quietly resenting his ex-wife for moving on fine. When the truth was, she'd spent every dollar and every hour she had on 3 children who weren't even his, and never once asked him for help. She said it plain, in a cafe apron, when he asked where the years went. That's where it went. It went where love goes when nobody's watching. And so should yours. If somebody in your life carried a weight in silence that you only found out about later, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button, because it helps stories about quiet, uncredited love reach the people who need them. And if you believe you don't split up what's left of a family, subscribe and join this community. There are more of us than you'd think. And nobody here gets left behind. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. We will see you there.